Hello friends, so today's video is going to be a new releases wrap up and I'll be discussing Tress of the Emerald Sea, The Stolen Heir, and Thorn Manor. I'll have timestamps down below if you'd like to skip ahead to any one specific book. I'm going to start with Tress because a lot of you have probably heard plenty about it, so if you want to skip ahead to the other ones, you can. So Tress of the Emerald Sea is the first of Brandon Sanderson's secret projects. And I have done a spoiler discussion and a non-spoiler review, so I'll have those linked if you'd like more in-depth thoughts. But this was absolutely delightful. It was so heartwarming, so adventurous, and in the discussion video I did, a lot of my friends were giving descriptions of how they would categorize this, and a lot of them said it was just so sweet, it was just so joyful, it was just so lovely, and all of those adjectives are the perfect way to describe the story. It is inspired by The Princess Bride, so if you yourself are a big fan of that movie or that story in general, then you definitely should give this a try, and you probably don't need to hear anything else about it. But in case you'd like a little bit more information, the setup is that we follow a young woman named Tress, and the man that she is in love with, something happens to him and she doesn't know what to do, and she decides, well, nobody else is doing anything, so I guess I should do something, and I'm going to figure out some kind of a rescue mission. And the story is not necessarily told through Tress's perspective, but rather a narrator who is definitely breaking the fourth wall and talking to you. And to some degree, you could argue that's any first-person perspective, but it's not quite the same. It's definitely very much you're being told the story, and then occasionally the narrator will start talking to you and will compare what you're reading here to what you might experience in your own life. So it kind of has this surreal feeling to some degree. And the narrator definitely increases the silliness of the story. They themselves are very silly, and it creates this kind of cheekiness that while I enjoyed, I will say I do think this is part of what contributed to this book feeling very youthful. So I think similar to The Princess Bride, this is the kind of story that can be enjoyed by so many different ages, and that narrator is part of why I think that a younger audience would also really like this. I believe this is technically considered adult fantasy. Some of the messages about life and things like that I think are going to be something that adults resonate with maybe a little more, but then some of the jokes and some of the tropes, I guess you could say, or some of the themes themselves are also things that I think are important for young people to read about, and there are certain things that I think young people will see themselves well represented through. And anyway, getting back to the narrator though, because they have this silliness to them, it definitely creates this kind of goofy, bumbling about sort of feeling, but then at the same time, it is Tress and her determination that really pushes the story onward, and she is definitely a fantastic main character. She's somebody I think you can't help but root for, and she has just this innocent, loveliness to her, and the world itself, as she's navigating it to try and save her love, the world is where you're gonna get the signature Sanderson feel, because it definitely comes across more like sci fantasy. Instead of having water through their oceans, they have spores, and if the spores get wet, then different things can occur depending on the kind of spore, which makes traversing the ocean very dangerous, but this is the only way that Tress is going to be able to try and rescue the person she's trying to rescue. Along the way, she definitely comes across a lot of misfits and an animal companion, and I love a good animal companion in the story, and there's just a lot of sense of adventure in this. If you are somebody who maybe likes your adult fantasy to feel a little more serious, or maybe you want your adult fantasy to firmly sit in adult and not really feel like it could be young adult or middle grade, it probably won't be necessarily your favorite. If you absolutely cannot stand Sanderson's humor, you might not love this as well. And if you're somebody who maybe you like a romance story where it is more centered on like the angst or things like that, then this love story probably isn't going to be to your liking. But I do think that it's just such a fun, delightful ride that I have a hard time not recommending it. Is it my favorite thing by Sanderson? No. And the reason is because it doesn't quite get to those serious depths that I like for my absolute favorites to contain. Usually my absolute favorites are the kinds of books that have this full range of emotions, and a great example, it's actually a manga series, is Full Metal Alchemist. It has the campiest of campy and then the most heart-wrenching of heart-wrenching type of scenes, and so it's just the perfect blend for me. This kind of sits more in the adventurous fun, and it does that so well, but that would be why it's not my absolute favorite, because it really doesn't have any serious gut punches to it. But regardless, I do think that this is a lovely story, and I highly recommend it for anybody who's in the mood for a good, fun, cozy, lovely adventure story. Speaking of lovely, next up we have Thorn Manor. So Thorn Manor is actually a novella that occurs after the events of Sorcery of Thorns by Margaret Rogerson. Sorcery of Thorns, if you haven't read that, the setup is we are following a young woman who is determined to become what is basically like a guardian, a knight of these grimoires, these magical books that if something goes wrong with them, they can actually turn into monsters, and those monsters then can cause a lot of damage and a lot of harm to human beings. So it's really important that there are people that know what to do in the event that that occurs. And so our main character, Elizabeth, that's her dream. She loves the grimoires. She wants to protect the grimoires. She wants to be basically this knight type of figure. And then everything goes wrong when one day one of the grimoires does turn into a monster, and it is blamed on her. So from there, she's kind of trying to determine what actually happened and how to clear her name. And along the way, she bands together with a young, mischievous man and another individual who accompanies him, a servant of sorts. And so they're trying to discover the truth. So that's the setup for Sorcery of Thorns. Thorn Manor takes place after the events of Sorcery of Thorns. It definitely is one that you want to have read Sorcery of Thorns first. For a long time, Sorcery of Thorns was considered a standalone, but based off of what occurs in the novella, I'm wondering if we're eventually going to transition into this being a series. If we do, I still think that Sorcery of Thorns can be read as a standalone, and if you just kind of want to stop, you're going to get a complete story, so I don't want this to deter people from picking up Thorn Manor, or Sorcery of Thorns, I should say, because I know sometimes people don't want to get into something unless they know for a fact, is this a series or is it a standalone? Because if it's a series, I want to wait till the whole thing is out. You can read the first book and just be done with it. And I could be wrong, maybe she doesn't have intentions to make this a series, but I absolutely am leaning toward the camp of I'm pretty sure she is. Thorn Manor, while it takes place a little bit after, and it is very cute and sweet, and it's kind of focusing on the relationship building between two of the characters, and the reason it's called Thorn Manor is because there's some sorcery involved with the manner in which those characters are currently living. So you get this kind of sweet little whimsical fairy tale type of feel, but in the background, there's another character who there's something going on with them clearly, and you don't know what exactly it seems to be setting up toward, but that setup is hinted at, and then that's it. So you could end the novella like, oh, I guess there's stuff going on with that character, but I think that whatever's going on with that character is going to lead us into a plot line for potentially a series. I don't think even just a sequel. I think whatever comes after Thorn Manor is going to be almost like the first in a series, and Sorcery of Thorns and Thorn Manor are almost going to feel like prequels, and I'm really excited about it. I don't want to say who the character is, because I don't want to reveal, but if you've read Sorcery of Thorns, who's everybody's favorite character in Sorcery of Thorns? That character. That one, I feel like we're going to get something with that character, so I'm very excited. I hope we do, because thus far, we've not gotten a series from Margaret Rogerson. We've gotten Vespertine, which feels like the beginning of a series, but currently is just by itself. An Enchantment of Ravens, which was very cute. Sorcery of Thorns, which was fun and adventurous. And then Thorn Manor is precious, but again, there's this like sprinkle. Not giving warm fuzzies whatsoever. The last book for today, we have Stolen Heir by Holly Black. This takes place after the events of the Folk of the Air trilogy, which is The Cruel Prince, The Wicked King, and The Queen of Nothing. So you do want to probably read those books before picking this one up. I suppose you could read this one without having read that other trilogy, but they reference so many of the events in the original trilogy, and they reference them in a way where you're kind of going to be spoiled. So I know some people, when it comes to these kind of continuation series, something like the Grisha trilogy versus the Six of Crows duology, people will say you can read the Six of Crows duology, it's separate enough. I don't know if this is separate enough. I actually kind of wished I'd reread the Folk of the Air before reading this, because of all of those references that I remembered, but I remembered because they were telling me, not because I recalled that, and then as they said it, I was like, oh my gosh, they mentioned it. It was like kind of more of a reminder, like, oh yeah, that's what happened. So I remember key events from the original trilogy, but these are following different characters, some characters that were introduced in the Folk of the Air, but were not the main characters and we were not focused on. So now we are focused on these characters, and that character goes by Ren. And so this character was one that I really enjoyed, is probably not the right word, but I liked the way that Holly Black wrote her. She is somebody who is living essentially off of garbage, whatever people throw out. She eats what she can. She's living in isolation. She's kind of living in the wild, and she's kind of living the life of almost like an animal. She's very alone. She has absolutely no one, and it's pretty heartbreaking to see. You see the way in which she so badly craves family. She so badly craves companionship, and that's such a motivator for her, but it's also a fear. She acknowledges and understands that she is like this, but then she will fight the urge to accept when somebody is being kind to her, and because the Fae are very wicked, she also thinks that anytime a Fae is showing her any form of kindness, that it must be a trick. And so she's kind of her own worst enemy, but it's so sad because it's so clearly rooted in all of the trauma that she has gone through. And then the other character is one where they seem so sweet, they seem so nice, and they seem like they genuinely are being a good person. But the way that this series is, if you've read the first trilogy, you know there's always something. But is there? And it kind of gets in your head. And then so you feel very connected to Ren in that sense, because you too are wondering, are these characters just, are they playing some kind of game? Is there some kind of mystery afoot that I'm not picking up on? And if so, what could be their motivation? And they can't lie, but how they just worded that, are they actually saying something else? And so I do like that. That was my favorite part about the original trilogy, and I think it was done the best in the second book, The Wicked King. I think that is done in this as well. The downside for me was I really liked the first half, but then the second half, I still enjoyed it, and I did like some of the twists and turns that we got in this first book. But I did feel like at some point it felt meandering. The plot was a little convoluted, and what I mean by that is sometimes I'm like, what exactly is the antagonist here? Because they're talking about an antagonist, and they're talking about what they need to accomplish, but it never really felt like we were up against anything. And in a story where we're focused on the characters, I usually don't mind that, but it was such a motivator as to what they were doing and where they were going that it felt almost a little too distant for me at times. And the other side of things is, I think in the original trilogy, part of the appeal is the way that Holly Black writes the Fae world. The colors, the way they dress, the way they do their hair, the kinds of creatures that you see, the architecture. And it's present, but not nearly to the same amount that I would have liked, because so much of it, these characters are kind of traveling somewhere, but they're taking the hidden path. They're not really on the main path, and they're not really interacting with other people. They're not really always going to engage in the courts and things like that. So you're not getting quite the same vibrant world building that we got in the original trilogy. I actually do, though, like the way that these characters were written. I liked the constant questioning of, are they up to something? I liked that quite a bit, but I am curious what we're going to get in the second book. Definitely enjoyed this. I think if you liked the original trilogy, you'll probably like this as well. And if you didn't like the original trilogy, maybe you'll like this one more because it is a little different and the characters are a little different, but I do think it's kind of definitely feels like we're coming back into that world. That's it for some new fantasy releases. I will have all relevant links and information in the description bar down below. Definitely let me know your thoughts on these if you have picked them up or if you plan to pick them up. But anyway, thanks so much for watching. I hope you have a lovely rest of your day, and I'll see you later. Bye.